Imagine this, it's the middle of summer. The sun is shining, kids are playing, neighbors are finally coming out to enjoy the season. And then, out of nowhere, your HOA drops a brand new rule. No more barbecues, ever. No sizzling burgers, no smoky grills, no backyard get-togethers. Just silence. At first, people think it's a joke, but then the warnings come. Letters slip into mailboxes. The board insists it's about safety, but deep down, everyone knows this isn't about fire hazards. It's about control, and that's when frustration turns into something else. The neighbors could have argued, they could have begged the board for permission, but instead, they came up with an idea no one expected. A block party. Not just any block party, but a full-scale, rule-proof celebration designed to show the board what real community looks like. No grills, no smoke, no technical violations. Just food, music, lights, and unity. A party so big and so joyful that the board would have no choice but to take notice. What started as a ban on barbecues quickly became a showdown between authority and the people it tried to silence. On one side, the board with its rules and restrictions. On the other, everyday residents armed with nothing but creativity, solidarity, and a refusal to give up their summer traditions. This isn't just a story about burgers and hot dogs. It's about power. It's about what happens when ordinary people say, enough is enough. You're about to hear how a simple ban spiraled into a movement, how neighbors who barely knew each other came together, threw the biggest party their community had ever seen, and forced the board to admit they had gone too far. Because sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger, it's with celebration. This is the story of the block party that changed everything. So, grab a seat. Because what you're about to hear will make you laugh, make you shake your head, and maybe, just maybe, inspire you the next time someone tries to take away the simple joys of life. Welcome to when the board banned BBQs. So we threw a block party. It began with a simple email, the kind most residents almost ignored. The subject line read, Rules Update, Outdoor Cooking and Open Flames. At first glance, it looked routine, just another HOA announcement about maintenance or parking, but when residents opened it, the message was far from routine. The board had announced a sudden and complete ban on all forms of outdoor grilling. Charcoal, propane, smokers, wood-burning devices, every method of cooking outdoors was now prohibited. The new rule applied to patios, balconies, courtyards, and any area within 20 feet of a building. To make the decision even more severe, the board made the ban effective immediately, with fines starting at $100 for the first violation and escalating to $500 for repeated offenses. For Maple Courts, this decision cut deep. Grilling wasn't just about food. For years, neighbors had gathered in the shared courtyard almost every evening. Families came down with foil pans and tongs. The smell of meat sizzling on a grill would drift through the air, while children played games nearby and adults shared stories. It was an easy, unspoken tradition that brought everyone together. The grills were not luxuries. They were the heartbeat of the community, and now, with one email, that heartbeat was silenced. The board justified the move by citing fire codes, insurance liabilities, and the vague claim of near-miss incidents. Yet when residents thought back, no one could remember a single grill-related fire. The reasoning felt hollow, and worse, it was delivered without any warning, without any discussion, and without any chance for the community to give feedback. The message wasn't an invitation to talk. It was an order. That evening, the impact was visible immediately. The courtyard, usually alive with smoke and laughter, was silent. No grills sparked to life, no conversations flowed across picnic tables, and no music played in the background. Even the neighborhood dog that barked at every sound seemed subdued. The heart of the community had been switched off like a light. The silence didn't last long. Frustration spread quickly. Residents began to talk, both online and in person. Some dug through the HOA's governing documents and noticed something important. The rules said the board could adopt reasonable policies, but whether a complete ban in the middle of summer was reasonable was up for debate.
Others checked past records and realized the justification for safety concerns was shaky at best. In more than a decade, there had been no fire department calls related to grills, no incident serious enough to warrant a sudden emergency.
Rule. Yet the board wasn't finished. A second email arrived the very next day. This one wasn't about the ban itself, but about enforcement. The board claimed that community ambassadors would patrol evenings and weekends to ensure compliance. The residents had never heard of ambassadors before, and in addition to that, neighbors were encouraged to report each other for violations through the HOA app. The tone had shifted from safety to surveillance. The neighborhood wasn't just losing its grills, it was being asked to police itself. Soon after, flyers appeared on every mailbox kiosk. They showed a stock photo of a grill crossed out with a red slash, accompanied by the words, "Reminder, BBQ ban in effect. Protecting our community." Instead of reassurance, the posters only fueled resentment. Residents felt patronized, treated as if their simple gatherings were dangerous acts. The neighborhood that once thrived on casual connection now felt tense, watched and divided. But in the midst of anger, something else started to grow. Neighbors who had once only shared food began sharing determination. They met in the courtyard one evening, this time without their grills, and pulled chairs into a circle. It was a different kind of gathering, one born not of tradition but of necessity. In that circle, the frustration took shape as a plan. Some volunteered to check public records, determined to find out if the fire department had truly been involved in any recent incidents. Others promised to look into insurance, to see if the board's claim of premium increases could be verified. Residents with knowledge of the bylaws pointed out that sudden rule changes without community input might not even be legal. Piece by piece, they began to gather evidence. And as they talked, a new idea started to emerge, one that shifted the energy from complaint to action. The residents realized that the ban wasn't just about grilling. It was about the board's overreach, about rules that disrupted community life without fairness or reason. If the board could erase a tradition overnight, what else could they take away? The issue had grown larger than food. It had become about their right to live freely in the space they paid for and cared for. The more they discussed, the clearer it became that they couldn't simply wait for the next board meeting to express their concerns. The fines were set to begin before any community listening session could take place. The board was moving forward without hesitation, and the residents would have to respond just as firmly. Out of this frustration, the idea of a block party began to take shape. Not a reckless, defiant cookout that could be punished with fines, but a carefully planned event, one that followed every code, every technical guideline, and every restriction, yet still reclaimed the spirit of their community. The residents envisioned a gathering with electric griddles, compliant cooking stations, proper signage, music kept within the decibel limits, and even an invitation to local officials to demonstrate fire safety. The concept was simple but powerful. To prove that the HOA's blanket ban was unreasonable by showing what a safe, organized, and joyful gathering could look like. By the time the courtyard lights flickered on, the residents weren't just angry anymore. They were united. What had started as a sudden ban on barbecues was becoming a story of resistance, resilience, and the determination of a neighborhood to defend its way of life. The HOA board had expected silence and compliance. Instead, they had lit a spark, not of fire, but of community spirit. The residents of Maple Courts were ready to fight back, not with arguments shouted at closed doors, but with an act of unity that no rule could easily erase. And so, the story of the block party began. The announcement of the barbecue ban might have silenced the courtyard, but it did not silence the residents. In fact, it did the opposite. The rule became the spark that pulled people out of their apartments and into conversation. The courtyard, once filled with smoke and laughter, was now filled with determination. What began as casual frustration quickly turned into organized resistance. Neighbors who had rarely spoken before now found themselves united around a shared purpose: to challenge the board's decision. For years, the HOA had made rules with little pushback, counting on residents to grumble privately but comply. This time, however, something felt different. The community had been pushed too far. The first step was information. Residents knew that if they wanted to confront the board effectively, they couldn't rely on anger alone. They needed facts. So they divided the work among themselves. Some agreed to research the fire codes the board had cited. Others planned to review the governing documents, looking for loopholes or requirements the board might have ignored. And a few residents began reaching out to city offices, insurance brokers, and even the fire department to see if there was any truth to the claims of safety concerns and premium increases. The findings came in quickly, and they told a clear story. The fire department had no recent records of incidents related to grills at Maple Courts. The insurance broker explained that while communities were encouraged to review safety policies, there had been no requirement for a complete ban. And the bylaws themselves revealed that sudden rule changes were only allowed without community input if there was an immediate threat to safety, something the board had failed to demonstrate. In short, the board's decision had been built on shaky ground. The rationale sounded official, but the facts did not support it. With this knowledge, the residents gained confidence. They were no longer just complaining about a rule they didn't like. They were standing against an overreach backed by evidence, and with that confidence came a stronger sense of unity. As word spread through the complex, more and more neighbors joined the effort. Families who had never attended meetings before signed petitions and shared stories about how grilling had brought people together. Longtime residents recalled how cookouts had been part of the community for decades. Even those who didn't own grills admitted that they valued the tradition because it made the neighborhood feel alive. Soon the courtyard became a meeting ground again, not for food, but for strategy. Folding chairs circled around the center, not with plates of barbecue, but with notebooks and plans. There was an energy in the air, the kind that comes when people realize they have more power together than they ever did apart. Yet the residents knew that simply showing up at the next board meeting would not be enough. The board had already made its position clear. They were not interested in discussion, they were interested in control. So the community needed a different approach, something that could not be brushed aside with polite nods and vague promises. That was when the idea of the block party began to take shape. The concept was simple yet brilliant. If the board claimed that grilling was unsafe, then the community would show them what safety truly looked like. They would organize a gathering that followed every regulation to the letter. They would cook only on allowed equipment, maintain all clearances, and even invite local officials to participate. It would be more than a protest. It would be a demonstration of what reasonable community life should look like. The block party would serve two purposes. First, it would bring the neighbors together again, restoring the sense of unity that the ban had threatened to break. Second, it would put the board in an impossible position. If they tried to shut down an event that was completely compliant with all rules and safety standards, they would expose themselves as unreasonable. And if they allowed it to happen, they would have to acknowledge that their total ban was unnecessary. Planning began immediately. Committees were formed for food, for music, for permits, and for outreach. Some residents offered to bring electric, griddles, and portable induction cooktops. Others volunteered to handle decorations and seating. A few took charge of communications, designing flyers and messages that could be shared across the community. But the most important part of the plan was the symbolism. The block party wasn't just about cooking. It was about reclaiming the courtyard, proving that the space belonged to the residents, not just to the board. Every detail, from the setup of tables to the arrangement of chairs, would be chosen to highlight the strength of the community. As the preparations unfolded, something remarkable happened. The frustration that had divided people from the board began to bind the residents to each other. Strangers became allies. Neighbors who had only nodded in passing now shared phone numbers and worked side by side. The act of resisting the ban created a stronger community than the board had ever imagined. Of course, not everyone was supportive. A small number of residents, often the same voices who had cheered the ban, criticized the plans. They argued online that rules were rules and that the board had the right to enforce them, but their voices were drowned out by the growing excitement. For every complaint posted on the app, there were 5 new signatures added to the petition. For every sarcastic comment, there were 10 volunteers ready to help. By the end of the week, the block party had transformed from an idea into a movement. The courtyard buzzed with quiet anticipation. People who had once felt powerless now walked, with purpose. The board had wanted to eliminate community gatherings. Instead, they had inspired the largest one Maple Courts had ever seen. The ban on barbecues was meant to shut people down, but in reality, it had done the opposite. It had awakened them. The residents were no longer passive tenants living under the watch of a distant board. They were neighbors, united by a common cause, ready to stand up for their way of life. And while the grills remained cold for now, the community spirit burned brighter than ever. The stage was set. The courtyard that once smelled of food would soon echo with something even stronger, the sound of a neighborhood standing together. The idea of a block party began as a spark, but in only a few days it grew into a fire that no rule or regulation could extinguish. What started as quiet frustration had turned into organized energy, and that energy spread quickly across Maple Courts. For the first time in years, residents were not just neighbors sharing a property line. They were teammates, allies, and builders of a collective vision. The courtyard, once silenced by the ban, became the center of activity again. During the afternoons, small groups would gather around picnic tables, notebooks in hand, sketching out the details of the event. By evening, porch lights glowed as people moved from apartment to apartment, checking in with each other and offering help. The buzz of preparation replaced the sizzle of grills. Every great event needs leadership, but at Maple Courts, leadership came from everywhere. There was no single figure at the top. Instead, the responsibility was shared. Ms. Jensen from Building 3 volunteered to coordinate food stations. She had experience running bake sales at the local school and knew how to stretch a budget. Mr. Alvarez, a retired electrician, offered to manage the setup of lights and sound, ensuring that the event would be both festive and safe. Younger residents, more skilled with technology, created group chats and digital sign-up sheets, making it easy for everyone to see what was needed. What made the planning remarkable was not just the efficiency, but the sense of ownership. Each person felt that their contribution mattered. A teenager who designed a flyer was as vital to the cause as the neighbor who arranged folding tables. The block party was not a single person's vision. It was a community's creation. The preparation also brought with it a new kind of joy. Neighbors who had once avoided small talk in the hallways now found themselves laughing over shared tasks. People discovered talents they never knew their neighbors had. The quiet retiree turned out to be an excellent graphic designer. The busy single father revealed he could play the guitar and volunteered to provide music. Each revelation stitched the community closer together, piece by piece. The opposition from the board, meanwhile, remained largely silent. They had issued their rule and assumed compliance, as they always had before. But as whispers of the block party reached them, unease began to spread among their ranks. At first, they dismissed it as harmless chatter, a temporary rebellion that would fade. But as more flyers appeared in windows and as more residents openly discussed preparations, it became impossible to ignore. The board faced a dilemma. To stop the event outright would make them look authoritarian, especially since the party was being carefully planned within the rules. But to allow it would risk undermining their authority. The ban had been sold as necessary for safety, yet here were the residents organizing a safe, joyful alternative that challenged that narrative. The tension added a quiet drama to the preparations. Every day that the board stayed silent was a small victory for the residents. Every absence of interference meant the plan could move forward, growing stronger and more polished. As the date drew closer, the scale of the party exceeded all expectations. What was supposed to be a modest gathering of a few neighbors transformed into a full-blown celebration. Tables would line the courtyard, decorated with colorful cloths and lanterns. Music would echo between the buildings, blending laughter with rhythm. Children would have games to play, and families would bring dishes that carried pieces of their culture. The food itself became symbolic. Without grills, creativity flourished. Electric cooktops and crock-pots took center stage. Dishes ranged from stews and casseroles to vegetarian spreads and homemade breads. Residents who had never cooked for the community before stepped forward, eager to contribute. The absence of smoke did not mean the absence of flavor. If anything, it made the menu more diverse, reflecting the richness of the community itself. But perhaps the most striking feature of the preparations was the inclusivity. The block party was not just for those who opposed the board. It was for everyone, even those who supported the ban. Invitations were slipped under every door, written in warm, welcoming language. The message was clear. This was not about dividing the neighborhood into sides. It was about bringing everyone together under one common experience. This spirit of openness made it harder for the board to dismiss the event as simple rebellion. It was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was community in action, a living demonstration of what the HOA should have been supporting all along. As momentum built, anticipation grew. Children counted down the days, marking calendars with excitement. Adults shared updates in the hallways, their voices carrying an eagerness that had been missing for too long. The block party had become more than a plan. It had become a symbol of hope. Hope that the community could govern itself with fairness. Hope that rules could be balanced with joy. Hope that Maple Courts could return to being more than just a collection of apartments. And with that hope came confidence. For the first time, residents felt they could look the board in the eye and stand as equals, not as subjects. The night before the event, the courtyard was quiet, but it was a charged quiet. Decorations lay stacked in corners, ready to be hung. Tables were folded against walls, waiting to be set. Lights were coiled neatly, prepared to shine. It was the calm before the storm, not of conflict, but of celebration. What the board had intended as an end to gatherings had instead fueled the largest one the community had ever seen. And though the grills remained silent, the voices of Maple Courts were louder than ever, ready to tell their story not with arguments, but with unity. The stage was set, and the first note of music was only hours away. The morning of the block party broke with a kind of electricity in the air. For weeks, the community had poured its energy into preparation, and now the day had finally arrived. The courtyard of Maple Courts, usually quiet on a Saturday morning, was alive with movement. People stepped out of their doors carrying boxes, folding chairs, crock-pots, and decorations. Children ran ahead with balloons tied to their wrists, eager to help in their own way. By mid-morning, the transformation was already underway. Long tables stretched across the courtyard, covered in colorful cloths. Neighbors hung paper lanterns from balconies, creating a canopy of soft colors overhead. Extension cords ran neatly along the edges, powering slow cookers and lights. The air, though absent of barbecue smoke, carried the aroma of dozens of dishes simmering: stews, curries, baked goods, pasta, and trays of fresh fruit. It was a mosaic of flavors, each dish telling a story of the person who made it. Music was one of the first things to fill the air. A pair of residents who had once been in a band set up speakers and microphones. As they tested the sound, a cheer rose from the courtyard. Soon the music rolled out, not too loud, but just enough to carry a beat that made the atmosphere light and festive. Laughter followed quickly, carried from group to group as people began to gather around tables and greet one another. By afternoon, the courtyard was unrecognizable. What had been an empty, rule-bound space was now alive with joy. Neighbors who had barely exchanged words in years sat side by side, sharing food and stories. Children played games with chalk, jump ropes, and hula hoops, their laughter echoing between the buildings. A group of teenagers volunteered to run small contests, sack races, trivia questions, even a spontaneous talent show. Every moment added another thread to the growing fabric of connection. The party's success was not measured only in food or music, but in the conversations that bloomed. People who had once felt isolated discovered common ground. A widow found new friends at her table. A young couple learned about the history of the complex from a retiree who had lived there since it was built. Even those who had been skeptical of the gathering found themselves smiling, drawn into the current of togetherness. Throughout the day, one truth became clearer. The block party was more than a response to the ban. It was proof of what the community could create when it leaned on each other instead of waiting for permission. The absence of grills had not weakened the gathering, it had strengthened it. Creativity replaced tradition, and joy replaced resentment. As the sun dipped lower, the courtyard glowed. Strings of lights flickered on, casting a warm brightness over the tables. The lanterns overhead swayed gently in the evening breeze, their colors softening into gold and orange. The music shifted to slower rhythms, and people lingered over desserts and coffee, unwilling to let the night slip away. It was during these golden hours that the presence of the board became noticeable. A few members had ventured quietly to the courtyard, likely to see the event for themselves. They stood at the edges, watching the celebration unfold. To their surprise, no one shunned them. Instead, residents waved them over, offered them plates of food, and invited them to join. The gesture was deliberate, a reminder that the party was never about exclusion. It was about unity. The board members, unused to being treated as equals, hesitated. Some accepted the invitations, sitting stiffly at first before slowly relaxing into the rhythm of conversation. Others remained distant, observing but not participating. Yet no matter their choice, the message had already been delivered. The authority of the board was not being challenged with anger, but with something more powerful, community spirit. As night deepened, the block party reached its peak. A local guitarist strummed familiar songs, and soon voices joined in, filling the courtyard with impromptu singing. The air was cool, but the warmth of the gathering made jackets unnecessary. Parents danced with their children, friends swayed arm in arm. Strangers became neighbors again. Even in its final hours, the event did not lose momentum. People helped each other clean up dishes, pack leftovers, and fold chairs, but the energy remained high. Conversations lingered long after tables were cleared, as if no one wanted to return to the old silence of the courtyard. By the time the last lantern was taken down and the final notes of music faded, Maple Courts had been transformed. The party was not just an event to remember, it was a turning point. The residents had proven to themselves and to the board that joy could not be legislated away. They had shown that when rules crossed into overreach, the best response was not bitterness but creativity. The courtyard, once empty and quiet under the weight of the ban, had been reborn. Its walls had echoed with music and laughter, its tables had been filled with food, and its people had been reminded of the strength they held together. When the final light was switched off, a new light remained in the hearts of everyone who had attended. The board might have banned the BBQs, but they could never ban the spirit of the community. The night of the block party would not be forgotten. It would stand as proof that when people unite, even the most restrictive rules can be answered, not with conflict but with celebration. The morning after the block party, Maple Courts had a different rhythm. The courtyard, though quiet again, seemed changed. The air still carried traces of the night before, faint laughter that seemed to echo in memory, a few stray balloons, clinging to railings, and the warmth of conversations that had stretched well past midnight. Neighbors who crossed paths exchanged knowing smiles as if they had shared a secret that words could not fully capture. But not everyone was smiling. Behind the closed doors of the HOA's meeting room, the board gathered in tense silence. Stacks of printed emails lay across the table, messages from residents who had praised the party and questioned the fairness of the ban. Some emails were polite, others pointed, but the tone was clear. The community was no longer willing to accept decisions handed down without question. For years, the board had relied on quiet compliance. Rules were written, notices were posted, and residents obeyed without much resistance. But the block party had broken that cycle. It wasn't just a gathering, it was a demonstration of unity, and unity was something the board had not anticipated. At first, the board tried to frame the event as a minor inconvenience. It wasn't technically a barbecue, one member muttered, flipping through a copy of the bylaws. No one violated the letter of the rule. But others weren't convinced. They had seen the photos circulating online, the videos shared on social media, and the pride in the residents' voices. The party had been more than compliance. It had been defiance in disguise. The ripple effect spread quickly. Local community blogs picked up the story, framing it as an example of neighbors finding creative ways to push back against overreaching rules. Comments poured in from outsiders, praising the residents for their ingenuity. The board, once confident in its authority, now found itself under a harsh spotlight. For the residents, the mood was lighter. Conversations at doorsteps and laundry rooms all circled back to the same point. Did you see how many people came out? Can you believe the board actually showed up to watch? I haven't had that much fun here in years. The courtyard, once a place of silence, had become a stage for possibility. People began to imagine what else could be done if they worked together. But unity brought momentum, and momentum brought pressure. Residents who had been passive before now wanted answers. A group of them began drafting a petition demanding that the barbecue ban be reconsidered. Others reached out to sympathetic board members, urging them to bring the issue back for discussion. The voices grew louder, and soon it was clear, ignoring the matter was no longer an option. Inside the boardroom, arguments sharpened. Some insisted the ban was necessary for safety and liability reasons. Others admitted privately that the decision had been rushed, made without proper consultation. The images of families gathered in joy the night before made their reasoning feel weak and disconnected from reality. It was difficult to argue against the sight of community spirit. The tension reached a turning point when one board member, usually silent, leaned forward and spoke. "We've lost them," she said. "We can't govern people who don't respect us. And right now, after last night, they don't. If we want to rebuild trust, we need to admit we overstepped." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The others shifted uncomfortably, but no one could deny the truth. Authority, after all, was fragile. It rested not on rules alone, but on the willingness of people to follow them. And if people no longer believed in the board's fairness, the foundation of that authority began to crack. Meanwhile, the residents continued their quiet campaign. They weren't hostile. They were determined. Flyers appeared on doors, inviting neighbors to sign the petition. Conversations at the mailbox turned into strategy sessions. The same creativity that fueled the block party now fueled the movement for change. The board, cornered by both public opinion and internal division, scheduled an emergency meeting. Word spread quickly and anticipation grew. People whispered about what might happen. Would the board double down, or would they finally listen? When the day came, the community room was packed. Residents filled every chair, stood along the walls, and even gathered outside the doors. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of history in the making. For years, attendance at board meetings had been sparse. Now, the board faced a crowd larger than they had ever imagined. The meeting began stiffly, with the usual formalities, but soon the topic turned to the ban. A resident stepped forward to speak, holding the petition now covered in signatures. Her voice was steady, her words respectful but firm. "We understand the need for safety," she said, "but this rule was not made with us, it was made against us. And last night proved that this community can come together responsibly. We want our voices heard." Applause followed, loud enough to rattle the windows. The board shifted in their seats, some looking down at their papers, others meeting the gaze of the crowd with forced composure. The weight of the moment pressed on them, a reminder that leadership was not about control, but about trust. As residents continued to speak, a pattern emerged. No one called for chaos. No one shouted. Instead, they shared stories of what barbecues had meant: family traditions, friendships, moments of joy. They spoke of last night's party, of how it had reminded them what community felt like. The message was clear. The ban had taken something vital, and the people wanted it restored. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board had no illusions. The tide had turned. The ban was no longer just a rule on paper. It had become a symbol of disconnect, of authority wielded without care. If they wanted to hold on to any respect, they would have to reconsider. That night, as the residents filed out of the meeting room, they carried with them not frustration, but hope. The block party had sparked something larger than anyone had expected. It had become more than an event. It was the beginning of a movement. And though the final decision still hung in the balance, the residents of Maple Courts already knew. One thing, they had found their voice and it would not be silenced again. The days following the emergency meeting at Maple Courts felt different from anything the community had experienced before. The air was lighter, conversations more frequent, and the energy of unity lingered long after the crowd had dispersed. Neighbors who had once passed one another in silence now exchanged words of encouragement, knowing they had stood together in front of the board and spoken with one voice. Behind the scenes, however, the HOA board wrestled with their next steps. The petition had been signed by a staggering majority of residents, leaving little room for dismissal. They could no longer hide behind formalities or the language of bylaws. The people they governed had demanded change, and the spotlight was squarely upon them. Emails continued to flow into the board's inbox, each one polite but firm, urging reconsideration. Even residents who had been indifferent to the barbecue issue before now weighed in, emboldened by the collective strength they had witnessed. What had begun as frustration over a single ban had transformed into something larger, a conversation about how the board operated and whether decisions were being made with or against the community. The board scheduled a follow-up meeting. This time, the anticipation was even greater. Word spread quickly, and once again, the community room filled to capacity. Residents sat shoulder to shoulder, the buzz of whispered conversations weaving together into a hum of expectation. No one knew what the board would decide, but everyone understood the stakes. When the board members entered, their expressions betrayed the weight they carried. Gone was the confidence of authority. In its place was a visible awareness that they faced not just a rule book, but the hearts and minds of their neighbors. The meeting opened with routine announcements, but all eyes were fixed on one agenda item, the barbecue ban. When the chair of the board finally spoke the words, "Next, we will revisit the outdoor grilling policy," the room fell silent. The chair cleared his throat and began. He acknowledged the petition, the turnout at recent meetings, and the community's passion for the issue. "We have heard you," he said carefully, "and we have realized that the decision to impose a complete ban was not handled with the level of consultation it deserved. For that, we apologize." A murmur swept through the room, surprise, relief, even cautious disbelief. Apologies were rare in the history of Maple Courts. The chair continued, outlining the new proposal. Rather than a full ban, the board would introduce safety guidelines, designated grilling areas, fireproof mats, and restrictions on open flames during high-risk weather. It was a compromise, but most importantly, it was a reversal of the overreach. The spirit of barbecues, the gatherings that defined Maple Court summers, would be restored. The room erupted in applause. Some residents clapped politely, others cheered outright, but together their response filled the space with a wave of triumph. It wasn't just about grilling. It was about being heard, about reclaiming the sense of community that had been threatened. As the meeting concluded, neighbors lingered in the courtyard, talking excitedly about plans for the first official barbecue of the season. Some laughed at the irony. The rule meant to silence their grills had instead ignited a fire of solidarity. Others reflected on the lesson learned, that authority without accountability cannot last, and that even the smallest of rules can reveal the balance of power between leaders and the people they serve. In the weeks that followed, the courtyard once again filled with the familiar aromas of summer. Families gathered, children played, and the sound of laughter mingled with the crackle of grills. But there was something new in the air, a sense of pride, a quiet confidence that the residents of Maple Courts had changed the way their community worked. For the board, the episode became a turning point. Meetings grew more inclusive, and decisions were approached with greater transparency. The residents, no longer passive, attended in greater numbers, eager to keep the dialogue alive. The block party had not just reversed a ban. It had rewritten the relationship between the governed and those who governed. Looking back, residents would often smile at the story. "Remember when they tried to ban barbecues?" someone would say, and laughter would follow. But beneath the humor was a deeper recognition that unity had power, that creativity could outwit authority, and that a single decision, no matter how small, could awaken a community to its strength. And so every summer, as the smoke of grilling rose once again into the evening sky, the people of Maple Courts remembered not just the taste of food, but the victory they had claimed together. It wasn't just about barbecue. It was about belonging. It was about finding their voice. And most of all, it was about proving that when neighbors stand together, no board, no rule, and no ban can break the bonds of community